Hey everyone, I'm Kendall and I'm a digital painter, and today I'm painting something really special to me, my very favorite bird. I've been really into bird watching for the past year or so, and it's all thanks to one particular species, the American Goldfinch. I'll get into more of why I love them so much later in the video. This is my reference photo, and here is a video I took through some binoculars in my front yard. These little birds love sunflower seeds, and they're at my feeders more than any other bird. So let's get started with the painting. As an artist, one of my biggest struggles is that I tend to overdo my artwork. I'll just spend literally 40 hours on one piece and make it so overly perfect that you can't see the brushstrokes anymore, which I think makes it less interesting to look at. So my practice for today is that I'm going to only spend a few hours on this piece, and I'm going to try to leave the brushwork and mistakes visible. So I'm starting to just layer in the background colors. I really like the background of my reference photo, so I'm going to keep a similar feel with the blurry browns and reds. Looking back now, I think I should have made the background darker or maybe more reddish to add more contrast to the yellow bird, but I'll just have to keep that in mind for future paintings, I guess. I'm keeping my brush size pretty large for this part. I'm using the gouache brush, by the way, and the reason I'm using a large brush for this is because I want it to stay looking blurry. I'm adding big chunks of color, not small details, so that's why I don't need a small brush. And then just adding other details, like you can see the blurry twig in the background. I'm adding both the light pink color at the top of the stick as well as the darker color on the bottom. So now to start on the branch that the bird is standing on, I'm going to start adding more detail because I'm now working in the foreground. So that means I'm going to make my brush smaller, and I'm going to start making the edges more defined. I'm trying to get the general shape of the branch, but I'm not too worried about it being exact since branches come in all shapes and sizes and the photo is just for reference. However, I do want to make sure the placement of the branch within the background is pretty accurate because that will make a difference later on when I'm adding the bird. So the first things that I'm adding to create the shape of the branch are the highlights and shadows. I started with a medium shade, and then I'm adding a little lighter and a little darker, and then slowly adding more light and more dark until I get to the most dramatic colors on the top and bottom, and then adding more of the medium shade back again to blend. After I get the shape established, I'm adding the little twigs that are sticking out, like the one with a little red leaf on the end of it, very cute, and following a similar process with those. Now comes the most fun part, in my opinion, the details. You can see in the reference photo that the branch has all kinds of little bumps and grooves in the bark, and the way I can portray those is by adding more highlights and shadows to show that the light is hitting the branch unevenly since it isn't a smooth surface. So I'm going to use a new brush, one that is the texture and size of a pencil, and I'm adding lots of really small dots and squiggly lines in both the lightest tan and the darkest brown. I'm trying to let my hand move in a way that is controlled but random to imitate the way that the bark looks. So you can see the final result close up looks like a bunch of squiggles, but from afar it looks like bark texture. Now that I've finished the branch, I'm going to start sketching out the bird. I'm still using the pencil brush, and right now I'm just trying to outline the main shape in the correct color. While I'm doing this, I'm paying attention to the different colors in the background and the twigs on the branch to try to get my bird in the right spot. I'm not worrying at all about having sloppy lines because now is the time to just focus on making sure everything is the right shape and in the right spot, especially relative to itself. I'll worry about the details later. The background is slightly off from the reference photo in some places since I painted it quickly and I wasn't trying to be too precise, so I'm especially making sure the bird looks natural and the wings are in the right place, etc., rather than worrying that it's in the exact right spot relative to the background. Painting this bright yellow color reminds me of the reason why I started to love goldfinches in the first place. I never used to pay that much attention to birds, so when I first put a feeder out in my yard, I was genuinely shocked to see these bright yellow birds show up. I literally had no idea that there are such colorful birds here in Utah. So that made me realize I was missing a really significant part of the natural world, so I started to pay way more attention when I'm outdoors, just generally, but especially to birds. Also, yellow is my favorite color, so I think it was meant to be. Speaking of yellow, now I'm going to start filling in my sketch. I'm starting relatively simple, but I'm trying to take note of the color variation within the blocks of color in the reference photo. Like, you can see how on the right side of the top of his wing, there's a shadow, so the yellow is less bright there. I go back and forth if I like to do one solid base color and then layer on the different shades after, or if I like to paint closer to the exact color from the start, like painting in each specific shade on top of the sketch. But in this piece, I went for more of one solid base color and then added layers of different shades on top. I think that's a little more natural for me. but I'd be curious to hear other artists' preferences in that regard in the comments. I like to keep my paintings really vibrant, so rather than making the highlights brighter by only making the yellow less saturated or more white, I like to also make them more green. A slightly greener and lighter yellow tends to pop more than just a lighter yellow of the same hue. In a similar way, I also like to make my shadows a little more red. Red is naturally darker at full saturation than yellow is, so you can darken yellow by making it more red rather than just making the yellow a darker value. To paint his wings and tail, I'm doing a similar process where I'm painting overall shapes first and then I'll add more detail later. I'm having a lot of fun with this part because I think the color contrast on goldfinches is just so stunning. Like, not only are they such a vibrant yellow, but the really stark color contrast on their wings with the black and white is like, damn, stop showing off already. Something else I love about goldfinches is that they're not very picky about how they eat seeds. Some birds will only eat from certain types of feeders and only certain types of seed, but goldfinches will eat from any feeder and will eat seeds off the ground after the feeder is empty, which is a good thing because a flock of them can clear out a whole feeder in a day easy. So I'll leave it empty for a couple days after so that they'll come back and clean up all the seeds off the ground, and then that way I'm not going through seed quite as fast. And then I'm starting to add some texture to his feathers. I say he on purpose, by the way. All of the bright yellow goldfinches you see are males. The females have some yellow, but they're much more tan overall. However, in the winter, even the males don't look very yellow because their winter plumage is pretty gray. You can tell spring is coming when they start getting bright yellow patches again. I'm adding texture by using my pencil brush and drawing a whole bunch of tiny little lines. I start by drawing little lines in the color that I'm using for my shadows, then adding a more medium tone on top, but less thick of a layer so you can see the shadow color underneath. And then finally a thin layer of highlight on top. This makes it so the feathers have depth. I especially like to add the liney texture to the edges of where two colors meet, so you can see I've added where the yellow feathers meet the black and white wings. I'm adding texture a little bit differently on the wings and tail. I painted the overall shapes with my gouache brush, which doesn't have very defined edges, so overall it looks a little blurry. Now that I like where everything is laid out, I'm going back with the pencil and making the edges defined. But I want it to look like feathers, so I'm moving my pencil up and down in a zigzag sort of motion rather than tracing it like a perfect line. Also, a lot of the black in the wings and the tail is actually dark brown when the light is shining on it, so I'm adding dark brown into the areas that are facing my light source. In a similar way, a lot of the white is in shadow, so I'm going over those parts with a light gray. Remember when I mentioned that I like to add the thin line texture to places where two colors meet? Well, now I'm adding it to the edges of the bird where the yellow meets the background. It's hard to tell in the sped up version, but to make the lines look more natural, I like to lift up my pencil in a swift, smooth motion at the end of each line to make it fade off and look more flowy. I'm in final detail stage now. I realized that the left side of the bird could use more contrast, so I'm adding more dark brown to the background around the edge of the bird to make him pop more. This is actually where I thought I was done yesterday, but I looked at him again this morning and I had added so much shadow and dark colored texture to his head and back that he looked like a very old man who had seen some shit. Which I respect, but it wasn't what I was going for, so I went back in today and spent just a few minutes adding more light yellow on top. But I pushed very lightly with my pencil so that the brush strokes would still show through. While I was at it, I decided to add a very light and slightly green yellow around all of the edges to make him look slightly backlit and pop more against the background. And that's where I'm calling him done. Here's a little zoom in so you can see more details. All the little brush strokes and squiggly lines, etc. that I think give it a lot of character and make it interesting to look at. So proud of myself for leaving him that way. I would love to hear what you thought of this video, so please let me know in the comments what you liked, disliked, or would like to see more of the future. Thanks so much for watching.